This is CNN Breaking News.
More disturbing, troubling news from Japan just into CNN. An explosive impact occurred Tuesday morning. It is now Tuesday morning in Asia at the earthquake-damaged Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant in the number 2 reactor. That is the same reactor, officials said earlier today, had its rods fully exposed during a cooling problem. They were pumping seawater in. They had a temporary problem with that. The rods were fully exposed at one point. Now we are told of an explosive impact. This is said to have occurred just about 2 hours ago at 5:14 p.m. here in the east, 6:14 a.m. Japan. This as Japanese authorities continue pumping seawater into the 3 crippled reactors at that site, trying to keep their radioactive fuel rods covered in an effort to cool them down. If the fuel rods were left exposed, those temperatures could build up 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. With radiation so intense, it could become impossible to deal with. Now, that's a worst-case scenario, but there are other possibilities, and many of them also alarming. With us now is Arnie Gunderson, a nuclear safety advocate who consults with Vermont state government about the Vermont Yankee nuclear plant. Also, New York Presbyterian Hospital's radiation oncologist-in-chief, Dr. Clifford Chow. Mr. Gunderson, I want to go straight to you first. The Yankee plant is not terribly unlike these plants we're dealing with in Japan. When you hear the authorities, after hours ago saying that all of those rods, all 3 reactors, have been somewhat exposed, number 2 had been fully exposed. Now they're talking about a, quote, explosive impact in the number 2 reactor again this morning. What does that tell you?
It tells me that the fuel is clad with something called zirconium, and it strips the water into oxygen and creates hydrogen. So when you hear of a hydrogen explosion, it means that the fuel was at least at 2,200 degrees. After the fuel gets to that point, all of the little fuel pellets fall out and wind up on the bottom of the nuclear reactor where they can form a molten mass.
And they form a molten mass. At this point, you've seen the hydrogen explosions come out. At this point, have you seen anything that leads you to doubt the words of Japanese officials that they believe the containment dome is secure and that while they're having a very, very troubling event inside, at the moment, the risks to the public are still, the government says, moderately low?
The containment is leaking. It's not leaking severely yet. You recall that when this accident started, there was already iodine and cesium picked up off-site. That was an indication the containment was leaking. But it's probably relatively low yet. Another hydrogen explosion might change that, though. Well,
Dr. Chow, help us when the scientists and the government says relatively low radiation escaping. Talk to us about the human impact in the terms of the people who live in that community who have been exposed to at least low levels of radiation. We've also heard from the U.S. military that they had operations, the USS Ronald Reagan off the shore, that some of its aircraft came back with evidence of radiation exposure. At what point, sir, would you start to get a little nervous?
Well, John, thank you for having me. I think the important one is that the wind radiation leaking out basically is iodine-131 is of concern. What happened is the past experience with the Chernobyl, for example, in 1986. What happened is iodine-131 get into the air, travels through the crowd, and fall into the human body by certain acids. What happened is iodine-131 trapped into the thyroid, and follow up 10 years afterward, that the only side effect disease that are being reported by NRC is a thyroid disease. Now, those thyroid disease actually related to cancer afterward, and this is very important to continue to monitor even the tracer amount of it. Because
go ahead, doctor.
Okay, because the younger the patient exposed to iodine-131, the more profound impact would that be to their life afterward.
And Mr. Gunderson, I want to come back to you, and I just have an animation here of the 3 reactors up here. They're now pumping seawater into this one. They have issues with cooling in the other ones. Essentially, this plant, I assume, is done. And they were hoping it doesn't turn into more of a disaster. But what happens on a site like this now? They're in the middle of this emergency operation. What's your number one concern when you hear 2 reactors where they have significant problems and one where they have the risk, they say, of a full meltdown?
There's 2 problems. One is up, one is down. There's a risk of a meltdown in all 3 reactors because this molten mass is at the bottom of the reactor. And that could be at any one of the 3, although it seems like the second one is more likely. The other one are the fuel pools, which are way up high in this design, and that's very similar to Vermont's. The fuel pools are not being cooled. So what they're doing there is they're pumping water in and letting it boil off, and just like you would a pot on a stove. It's boiling. They're not cooling it, but they're just replacing it with ocean water.
And Dr. Chow, you've heard the government saying it's evacuating people back. From everything you have heard and seen, are they handling this in the right approach, or do you think they need to be more aggressive?
Well, I think they handled it correctly, but because learn from what the Chernobyl experience, that when that happened, the first thing is that you need to evacuate the people away from the area of the contamination. And number two, I think that they're also doing correctly is handing out some iodine pills to counter any potential fallout of those iodine-131 radioactive material from the sky.
Mr. Gunderson, a lot of Americans who might be watching tonight saying, could this happen here? You know the Yankee plant in Vermont. You understand the design of other facilities. I would guess that the California plants are in more of a seismic risk area. Do you have any concerns? Obviously, the systems are designed. You have the normal pumping, then you have the backup pump, then you have the battery pumps. In this case, all three. These things are built to have redundancies. In this case, all three failed. Does every nuclear plant in the United States need now to have a go-through to triple-check all these systems?
I think, you know, suddenly what was before impossible has become possible, and we really need to go back through and look at what is the maximum credible threat. The 23 reactors in the America that are identical to this design are especially prone to this problem. And it's not about an earthquake, it's about a flood. And a flood, whether it's on the Mississippi River, on the Connecticut River, or a tsunami, would have the same effect on the cooling of this reactor. So a bad flood will do it no matter where in the United States you are.
And Dr. Chow, let me close by asking you this about this facility in Japan. If they continue to have the problems here, and this could go on for years, we are told, if they have to use the seawater to cool these down, to get the temperature down to a point where it's safe, how long would you keep people away from that facility, and where would you draw the circle?
Well, remember that the iodine-131 will blast out if happen into the sky, and then it can travel within hundreds of these, even 1,000 miles radius. There's no way they can predict how far you need to evacuate. However, good thing is that those iodine-131 fall-off is they have a half-life. Half-life only 8 minutes, and after, or I'm sorry, 8 hours, and after they're going to fall off quickly. So as far as they have immediate attention to those measurements and also take precaution of what to eat and what not to eat. And that's very important, especially some dairy product related to the cow and pasture. Those kinds of products is very important to pay attention to those.
Dr. Chow, Mr. Gunderson, I cannot thank you enough for coming in and sharing your expertise with us in the middle of this breaking news tonight. Hope we can keep in touch in the days ahead.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you both. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Coming up here,